Subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for being here. I'd like to begin this hearing first noting that in President Obama's press conference with Raul Castro yesterday, Raul Castro said that there were no political prisoners, daring people to come up with a list of political prisoners in Cuba. I have in my hand a list of more than 50 political prisoners compiled by my good friend Ileana Ros-Layton from information provided by a number of democracy and human rights organizations. And without objection, I would like to make that list part of the record. On one of those people is Alexander Reyes, sentenced to 5 years in prison on March 2nd of 2016, just a few days ago. His crime, tossing flyers with anti-government messages on the street. In fact, to punish him further, he went from one prison to the notorious Kilo 8 prison. Then there's the example of Yaciel Espinono Avila, who went on a hunger strike last year in protest of the abuses and torture meted out to political prisoners by the Castro brothers goons. And just this past Sunday, hours before the President Obama was to arrive in Cuba, Baptist pastor and religious freedom activist, the Reverend Mario Felix Leonard Barroso, was arrested by the regime, by the Castro regime, as well as his wife, Yoaxis, who was placed under house arrest. So again, without objection, I will make those a part of the record. I want to welcome you to today's hearing, Getting It Right this time, a victim-centered trafficking in persons report, at which we will look closely at the records of several countries, including Cuba, China, Malaysia, Oman, and Burma, and others, whose trafficking tier rankings were manipulated and falsified for political reasons in last year's report. As the prime sponsor of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, America's landmark law to combat human trafficking, which among its many policy provisions created the Trafficking in Persons report and the tier rankings, I am extremely disappointed and concerned that last year's TIP report gave a pass to several countries meriting Tier 3 accountability, countries whose trafficking victims desperately needed protection in America's powerful voice. The 2015 TIP report failed many of the victims, and the victims deserve better. The politically contrived passing grade for failing governments was exposed by a series of investigative reports by Reuters, and I and many others and anyone involved in human rights are grateful to Reuters for those articles. And they found that the professionals at the State Department, at the TIP office, made one set of recommendations only to be overruled at a higher level for political reasons. For example, the TIP office recommended Tier 3 ranking for Cuba, China, Malaysia, and Oman, 14 countries in all, which was rejected by the Obama administration at a higher level in last year's report. Each of the 14 countries were then given passing grades. Alexander Harney, Jason Zepp, and Matt Spetelnik of Reuters authored several incisive reports, including an expose on China's politicized ranking, finding, and I quote, 2 years after China announced it was ending the re-education through labor system, extrajudicial networks of detention facilities featuring torture and forced labor thrive in its place, close quote. China had deceived the United States in 2014 about this intention, and when that became apparent last year, we let them keep on with their ill-gotten upgrade on the tier ranking. The State Department must get the TIP report right, or we will lose the foundational tool created by the TPVA to help the more than 20 million victims of trafficking enslaved around the world. In the end, the Trafficking in Persons report is all about victims. The threshold question must be, as Ambassador Mark P. Lagon included in his 2008 TIP report, a country's performance is based strictly on the trafficking-specific criteria stipulated by the TVPA. A tier ranking is about protecting vulnerable lives, lives destroyed or saved by the on-the-ground impact of a government's action or inaction. We have seen many countries take a Tier 3 ranking seriously and make real, systemic, and sustainable changes that improve their tier rankings, but more importantly, protected trafficking victims And countries such as South Korea and Israel come to mind. When the Bush administration branded South Korea and Israel, two of our closest allies, but based on their records, branded them as Tier 3, both countries reacted and enacted and implemented robust policies to combat human trafficking and were given earned upgrades for their verifiable actions. But today we've seen other countries attempt an end around the accountability system with endless empty promises of action or mostly meaningless gestures of compliance. Congress in 2003 created the Tier 2 watch list for those countries, which may have undertaken significant anti-trafficking steps late in the evaluation year. Unfortunately, this ranking is being misused to reward insignificant actions and to enable irresponsibility. How would the 16-year-old girl being pimped legally in Cuba's sex tourism industry rank Cuba on human trafficking? I can assure you, not with a politically motivated passing grade. How would the Rohingya migrant trapped in Malaysian forced labor rank Malaysia when his trafficker laughs at the mention of penalties? How would the sex trafficking victim forced to do labor in a Chinese detention center year after year or be sent back to torture and death in North Korea rank China? How would a young boy rank Burma, where he has been forced to labor for the military while his sister is turned into a modern-day comfort woman? Tier rankings are about real prosecutions, real prevention, and real protection for real people who are suffering as slaves. Cuba is an egregious example of a nation being given an unwarranted passing grade because of other non-human trafficking considerations. Just read the report. The report leads you to the inevitable conclusion: stamp it, Tier 3, egregious violator. Yet, President Obama is there today hobnobbing with the very people who are kept in power by the profits of slave labor, the very people who do not have a law against labor trafficking because, of course, it doesn't exist, the very people whose hotels are filled with sex tourists who come to Cuba specifically to sexually exploit minors. My latest trafficking law, it's the fourth so far, the International Megan's Law, fights sex tourism but assumes a willing, non-profiting partner country. Some tourists go to Cuba because Cuba facilitates sex trafficking. Cuba also harbors criminals. Just ask the family of Warner Forrester, a New Jersey state trooper who was gunned down at a traffic stop by Joanne Chesimard. Cuba protects Chesimard to this day. Maria Verlaw will testify this afternoon that, and I quote, "What makes the Cuban case unique as well as astounding is that trafficking is a huge operation run by the government through numerous state enterprises with accomplices, participants, sponsors, and promoters all over the world. And that the Cuban dictatorship is involved in, quote, 4 main sources of human trafficking: export services for temporary workers, forced labor and sex trafficking, state-sponsored or forced migration, and export sales of human and body parts." Our State Department Trafficking in Persons report, however, addresses only 2 of these aspects, and in my view, does it quite poorly, she says in her testimony. The trafficking rankings should not be used as cheap chits and sweeteners that could be compromised in the hope of bringing about better governmental relations with Cuba or any other nation. Rather, better relations with Cuba or any other nation should be preconditioned on real protection for Cuba's prostituted children and women and recognition of labor trafficking. The President, it seems to me, is lending his stature, particularly as a Nobel Peace Prize winner, to the very people who are imprisoning human rights advocates at a higher rate than ever. Cuba's actions prove once again that lifting accountability only emboldens evil. The TIP report was meant to hold countries accountable for their failures to fight human trafficking. It was meant to speak truth to power. It was meant to speak for the trafficking victims, waiting, hoping, and praying for relief. In 2016, the TIP report must rank the governments on a country's performance that is based on the trafficking-specific criteria, as Ambassador Legon has said, stipulated by the TVPA. Every ranking must be assigned without, I repeat, without any political manipulation and without any dishonesty. Get the tiers right in 2016. The lives of many of the weakest and the most vulnerable, and U.S. credibility hang in the balance. I'd like to yield to Mark Meadows for any comments he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, good to see you again. Thank you for your work. Mr. Smith, welcome back, and certainly nice to meet you. And Mr. Chairman, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that you have been not only tenacious on this particular topic, but unrelenting and unyielding in your resolve, and I appreciate that. But more importantly, express my appreciation perhaps for the hundreds of thousands of children that are being trafficked across the country, across the world, that the political nature of manipulating the TIPS report directly harms. And I think that that's the underscoring message that should be brought forth here today, is when we play politics with the TIP report, those nations who see the need to become more aggressive in combating human trafficking and go from a Tier 3 to a Tier 2 put actions with their words. And if indeed they believe that for political reasons that they can bypass the TIP report, either through economic manipulation, through bilateral trade agreements, or the like, then they never address the underlying problem. They start to address it in other ways to make sure that they get off of that list, knowing that it has very little to do with human trafficking and everything to do with either their diplomacy or how they get involved in other aspects that are important to the United States. So I look forward to your testimony today. Obviously, I've been one of, I believe, 6 of my colleagues have signed on to a letter asking for the split memos as it relates to the TIPS decisions that have been made, because there is a recommendation was made, and obviously those split memos would give us real insight from the State Department on why those decisions and who made those decisions. And with that, I look forward to the expert testimony. It's good to have you back, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meadows. I'd like to now introduce our distinguished witnesses, beginning first with Ambassador Mark P. Legon, who is currently the president of Freedom House, the first independent American organization to advocate the advancement of freedom and democracy around the world. Ambassador Legon's long and distinguished career also includes the distinction of being our 3rd ambassador at large for human trafficking, as well as director of the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons at the U.S. Department of State. His record of involvement in human rights is long and diverse, spanning from Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of International Organization of Affairs, with responsibility for human rights, humanitarian issues, and the United Nations reform, through academia, where he was the chair for global politics and security at Georgetown University's Master of Science in Foreign Service program, and adjunct senior fellow for human rights and at the Council on Foreign Relations. Notably, Ambassador Legon has also served as the executive director and CEO of the anti-human trafficking nonprofit Polaris Project. Without objection, all of your full backgrounds and resumes will be made a part of the record. We'll then hear from Mr. Matthew Smith, who is founder and executive director of Fortify Rights and a 2014 Echoing Green Global Fellow. He has previously worked with Human Rights Watch and Earth Rights International. Mr. Smith's groundbreaking research has exposed wartime abuses and forced displacement, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing, multi-billion-dollar corporation development-induced abuses, and other human rights violations. He has also written for a variety of major media outlets. Before moving to Southeast Asia in 2005, Mr. Smith worked with Curry Kennedy of the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights on Speak Truth to Power. He also worked as a community organizer and an emergency services caseworker. Mr. Smith flew halfway around the world to be with us today, so we're very grateful for that sacrifice that he has made to be with us today. Well, we'll then hear from Ms. Jinjae Jin-Hae Jo, who was born in North Korea, and she lived there from 1987 to 1998. During this time, she lost her father, grandmother, and younger brothers because of hunger. Her older sister disappeared and is believed to have been trafficked into China. In 1998, she escaped from North Korea to China with her mother and younger sister, Grace. They suffered tremendously in China for about 10 years, surviving 4 repatriations to North Korea because they were considered illegal migrants by China. Finally, in 2008, Jin-Hae Jo and her family were able to come to the United States with refugee status. She formed a nonprofit organization called North Korean Refugees in the U.S. and has directly rescued North Korean females who were victims of trafficking and other refugees and assisted other North Korean refugees with resettlement in the United States. And thank you again for traveling so far to be here with us today. And then we will hear from Ms. Maria Verlaw, who co-founded in 2002 the Free Society Project and still heads the project, a nonprofit organization to advance human rights through research and scholarship. Its leading initiative, the Cuba Archive Truth and Memory Project, focuses on transitional justice issues and human exploitation. Ms. Verlaw is a former second vice president of Chase Manhattan Bank and a longtime independent consultant specializing in Cuban affairs and other international issues. Her extensive publications on Cuba cover a wide range of topics, including policy, international law, foreign investment, and other economic issues. She has served on task forces on U.S.-Cuba relations for the Council on Foreign Relations and the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you as well. I'd like to now yield to Ambassador Legon, such time as he may consume.
Thank you very much. Chairman Smith, Mr. Meadows, members of the subcommittee, I'm really pleased to again take part in your annual oversight effort.
Mr. Ambassador, could you move it a little bit closer to you so we can all
Okay.
hear a little?
I'm very happy to be back. I appreciate your annual oversight effort to anticipate an upcoming Trafficking in Persons report. Many associate trafficking with movement and migration of people, one of the vernacular connotations of trafficking. But while trafficking often involves migration, it need not. The word's also associated with poverty. Trafficking is seen as created by poverty. But I'd really like to drive home today that trafficking is not so much solely about being poor as it is about poor governance, poor rule of law, and poor access to justice. The most vulnerable to trafficking are groups denied equal protection under the law: minorities, migrants, women, and those who happen to be in multiple ones of those categories. When I was the director of the TIP office at State, I asked for the following passage to be placed into the introductory analysis in the 2008 report, and I've included the passage in full in my written testimony that I'd ask you to admit to the record kindly. But let me read a short part. Our broad study of the phenomenon of trafficking corroborates that healthy, vital, democratic pluralism is the single most prevalent feature of states conducting effective anti-trafficking efforts. A vibrant democracy is the best guarantor of human dignity and respect for the human rights and fundamental freedoms of all persons, including women, children, prostituted people, and foreign migrants, who are among the most vulnerable populations susceptible to trafficking. One official at the State Department actually fought with me about including this passage, questioning whether it was necessary to become democratic to fight TIP. My response to him in negotiating the final text of the report was, no, but it sure helps. Governance, rule of law, access to justice, and democracy in full, and not just elections, are at the heart of Freedom House's work. My executive vice president lauded me for what I included in the 2008 report, as if I knew I was going to be working for Freedom House later. Well, Freedom House started putting out reports that gave grades to other countries and to the United States 29 years before even the first TIP report. The latest Freedom in the World report, that was released in January, shows that more countries have gone in the wrong direction, 72 countries, than in the right direction, the largest gap between those figures in 6 years. In every one of the last 10 years, more countries have declined in political rights and civil liberties than those that have improved. And that is the first time of a decade-long slide in the 44 years of the report. If you look at the subscores of political rights and civil liberties measured consistently by Freedom House since 1972, the biggest declines are in 3 areas, all pertinent to human trafficking. Freedom of expression for civil society and press to call attention to the problem, freedom of association for labor unions and civil society groups to stand up for the vulnerable, and rule of law to fight corruption. Anticipating the 2016 TIP report, let's look at a few countries of particular concern in Freedom House's analysis and some countries of hopeful improvement in my organization's estimation. As for countries of particular concern, let's look at Malaysia and East Asia. It's ranked partly free in the 2016 edition of Freedom of the World. If the best score for Freedom House is a 1 and the worst score, least free, is 7, a 1 to 7 scale, it gets a 4 for both political rights and civil liberties. That country represented the single most striking and suspect ranking in last year's report, upgraded rather than getting Tier 3, presumably to keep it viable for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Let me say I and Freedom House are for the Trans-Pacific Partnership to create a context of rule of law, rules of the game for states. But as it stands today, Malaysia doesn't deserve to be part of that amalgam. In the Middle East and North Africa, Qatar is ranked not free in Freedom in the World, receiving a score of 6 for political rights and 5 for civil liberties. Revelations in the press about construction of facilities for upcoming international competitions and for American universities' campuses makes Qatar all the more troubling than the standard vulnerability for women and migrants that exist in Gulf countries. It's gotten Tier 2 watch list for 2 years. A very, very skeptical eye is due if it were to be given a waiver or a change. Saudi Arabia is one of the 12 worst human rights abusers in the world, according to Freedom in the World, receiving the lowest possible score of 7 for both political rights and civil liberties. It doesn't even have the pretext that exists for other countries in the Gulf that say that their foreign workers massively outnumber their local population. It's only a 56% total for the foreign workers in Saudi Arabia. It is the most important to the region if Saudi Arabia were to make reforms. It's the big player in the bloc. Smaller players have pretexts for not acting if the big player doesn't act. It shouldn't be given a carrot to induce change. It needs to be rewarded for real change. The Tier 2 watch list ranking last year deserves scrutiny. In Cuba, it was ranked not free in Freedom in the World, with a 7 for political rights and a 6 for civil liberties. It hasn't made much progress whatsoever, despite the resumption of diplomatic relations. It was raised to Tier 2 watch list, and that raised some eyebrows properly. Profoundly unfree conditions for workers without an independent voice from state power, and the raucous sex trade that Chairman Smith has already referred to, marketed to tourists abroad, remain reasons for close examination. There are some rays of hope. In Asia, Myanmar is ranked not free, but with signs of improvement, with its huge voter turnout for an overwhelming victory for Aung San Suu Kyi and her party. Yet armed military attacks against religious and ethnic minorities in the Kachin state and widespread discrimination and attacks against the Rohingya remain serious problems. Myanmar ought not to be given a pass or an unfounded bonus, despite some reasons for optimism. Sri Lanka is ranked partly free in Freedom in the World. Importantly, in 2015, voters in Sri Lanka ousted the increasingly authoritarian President Mahinda Rajapaksa and replaced him with Maithripala Sirisena. Sirisena, when taking office, overturned some of the most repressive policies that existed before and began repairing relations with the country's Tamil minority and the international community. Trafficking in Sri Lanka could involve a number of reasons. The South Asia bonded labor syndrome, one might call it. Sri Lankan migrant workers given insufficient help by their government abroad. Male and female sex trafficking, among other reasons. Just because there's reasons for optimism isn't a reason for great inflation. In the Middle East, Tunisia is the one country that has truly flowered since the Arab Spring, with a score of 1 for political rights and 3 for civil liberties. But with its new constitution and free elections, it's crucial for the United States and our democratic allies to provide robust support. If Tunisia doesn't implement the written plan that it supplied to the U.S. to avert a downgrade in 2015, or if it doesn't pass a comprehensive law on all forms of trafficking, the United States will do it no favor at all with a mercy ranking or a mercy waiver. In conclusion, there are a number of governments to watch closely that lie on that cusp between modestly addressing the problem of human trafficking, which we call Tier 2 watch list, and not appreciably trying at all, which we call Tier 3. These include Malaysia, China, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, and Cuba. It's worth looking where such nations fall in the larger picture of trends in governance and human rights in the last year and in the last decade, which it's Freedom House's job to monitor. Slavery is a special abomination, but it's inextricably part of a larger global scope of meaningful democracy, not just elections, but meaningful democracy in which all human beings resident in a country get justice in practice, or they don't. Thank you.
Mr. Legon, thank you very much for your testimony. As usual, your written statement, too, is extremely well documented, and without objection, it in its entirety will be made a part of the record, as well as the full statements of all of our witnesses and any extraneous matter you'd like to include in the record. Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Meadows. Distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I'd like to focus my testimony and share some information about 3 countries where Fortify Rights works, Myanmar, Thailand, and Malaysia. In Myanmar, or Burma, the Army, Border Guard forces, and non-state ethnic armies continue to recruit and use child soldiers. Forced labor also continues with impunity in public works projects and in situations of armed conflict in the country. Most recently, we documented how the Army forced ethnic Rakhine civilians to carry weapons and rations in a conflict zone and to dig graves for soldiers who were killed in the conflict under the threat of death. We've also documented the forced labor of ethnic Rohingya in northern Rakhine State, including thousands of children. We've received no information to suggest perpetrators have been held accountable or victims have been protected in these areas. Last year, tens of thousands of Rohingya Muslims fled western Myanmar on ships operated by human traffickers. We documented how Myanmar state security forces were actually complicit or directly involved in the trade. Perpetrators have not been held accountable. Today, boat departures of Rohingya have reduced greatly, but unfortunately that's not due to any notable change in the behavior by Myanmar authorities. Appalling abuses against the Rohingya continue. Myanmar had elections in November. We're very hopeful about the prospects of the NLD-led government, but it's essential that this year's ranking for Myanmar be objective. Despite the optics of democracy in the country, the Myanmar military remains the strongest political institution in the country. The State Department, in our view, should downgrade Myanmar and encourage the military to work closely with the NLD to end all forms of human trafficking. With regard to Thailand, in the last year, Thailand devoted unprecedented attention to human trafficking. Less than 12 months ago, criminals and complicit authorities were holding Rohingya refugees and Bangladeshi nationals captive in illicit torture camps, buying and selling them by the thousands. Those who couldn't buy their freedom were killed in some cases or sold into situations of continued exploitation. Today, to our knowledge, those camps no longer exist. Less than a year ago, Thai officials acknowledged mass graves of Rohingya and Bangladeshi victims of trafficking, and this month the human trafficking trial of 92 defendants resumed, including members of the Thai Army, Navy, and police. In the fishing sector, which has used slave labor for many years, Thailand passed legislation in December to address illegal fishing and establish monitoring and traceability mechanisms. Despite all of these efforts, however, severe problems remain. Extensive use of slave labor in the seafood sector has continued. Just 3 months ago, horrific slave labor in the shrimp peeling sector was exposed. In terms of prosecutions, just 3 months ago, a police major general who was the chief investigator and key witness in the Rohingya trafficking trial, feared for his life and fled to Australia, where he's seeking asylum. It's important to note that he feared government officials and state security forces. Other witnesses in that particular trial have also been threatened, and we're concerned that these threats may prejudice the trial. The investigation of trafficking of Rohingya in Thailand and Bangladeshi nationals in Thailand was also prematurely closed in 2015. Our information suggests there are additional mass graves in Thai territory, and Thai officials recently told us that human trafficking syndicates are still active in southern Thailand. These facts alone, in our view, would indicate the need for an ongoing investigation. In terms of protection for survivors, we recently visited 2 government-run shelters in southern Thailand where Rohingya witnesses in the high-profile trafficking trial are being held in detention. In the last year, some Rohingya in the shelter have reportedly gone missing. Needless to say, this is very concerning, and remaining witnesses in the country remain at great risk. As of December, only 12 of 500 witnesses in this particular trial were receiving formal witness protection through the Ministry of Justice. Following discussions we had with government officials, a cabinet resolution passed last week that would provide witnesses in human trafficking trials automatic witness protection under the Ministry of Justice. This is encouraging indeed. However, Thailand still maintains a pushback policy with regard to migrants, including potential survivors of trafficking arriving by boat. Last year, Thailand pushed boats of migrants out to sea despite that alleged traffickers operated the ships. Thailand also callously refused disembarkation for thousands of desperate Rohingya who were adrift at sea. Their boats were abandoned by human trafficking syndicates, and this cost untold lives. The pushback policy, in our view, is deadly and has no place in a regime intent on combating human trafficking. In Malaysia, last year, we recommended that Malaysia remain at Tier 3, as the government had done little to combat human trafficking. We share the view of you, Mr. Chairman, that Malaysia was upgraded to Tier 2 watch list for the wrong reasons and to make it eligible for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This threatened the objectivity and integrity of the TIP report. In the last year, Malaysian authorities uncovered more than 100 grave sites of Rohingya and Bangladeshi victims of human trafficking. Unfortunately, however, there was no apparent effort to investigate those responsible for creating those grave sites. Dozens of known traffickers roam free in the country with little fear of arrest. And this is just from the information that we've managed to collect. When thousands of Rohingya refugees and Bangladeshi nationals were stranded at sea in May 2015, Malaysia stepped up and allowed disembarkation, but this was not before authorities towed hundreds in these boats out to sea, cut the tow line, and sent them adrift. Today, those same survivors who were allowed to disembark in Malaysia remain detained in an ill-equipped immigration detention facility in Malaysia. This is hardly protection for survivors of human trafficking. Refugees and survivors of trafficking in Malaysia live in hiding. They're commonly fearful of police who routinely extort money from them. They feel they can't report crimes, including the crime of trafficking. I've personally witnessed a community of Rohingya refugees intervene to rescue a 15-year-old Rohingya girl from a trafficking syndicate that was preparing to sell her into sex work. The community told me that they could not report the crime to the police for fear that they would end up in detention. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, we believe Myanmar, Thailand, and Malaysia failed to meet the minimum standards in the last year and deserve Tier 3 status. Thank you again for the opportunity to join you today.
Mr. Smith, thank you very much for your testimony and for your insights. And I do hope the State Department is listening to your wise counsel. I'd like to now invite Jin Hye-jo to provide her testimony.
Good afternoon. My name is Jin Hye-jo, and I am the president of North Korean in USA, a non-profit organization representing North Korean refugees in the United States. I would like to thank you, Member of Congress and Ms. Suzanne Shorty, for giving me the opportunity to testify about the situation in North Korea, my home country. I have already testified about my family's story in similar hearing on several occasions. Of the 9 members of my family, only 3 survived and escaped North Korea to gain our freedom. However, today I stand here not to testify about my own experience 18 years ago, but to speak North Korea and China, two countries that have not changed their ways. As is well known to the international community, 3 million North Koreans have starved to death. Powers in the face of brutal dictatorship. Furthermore, those who were caught trying to escape the country were deprived of their rights, suffocating under the yoke of operation. They did unjust death in mobile labor, briquettes, political prison camps. Kim Jong-il, a dictator who atrociously murdered his own people, died before he could be brought to justice. Kim Jong-un, the third leader of their dynastic regime, continued to murder countries, ordered North Koreans through torture and starvation. During Kim Jong-il's rule, the North Korean regime was brought of shame before the international community as videos of North Korean children dying on the street spread on the internet. In response, the regime mobilized groups of discharged soldiers into arresting gojebi, or orphans, street children who were imprisoned in cold, dark detention center and put into forced labor. Many children died slow, painful deaths from malnutrition, barely surviving on lumps of corn and potato. The children whose parents went to search for food and did not return, the country's shoulder of those who praised behind the bears, they all cry out in pain to this day, asking to be granted the freedom of peace, free from the pain of hunger. I know this firsthand from what my sister, and I experienced when we were forcibly repatriated from China in June 2006. The fathers who escape in search of food to save their family are forcibly repatriated by Chinese government. Once repatriated into the custody by North Korea's state security department is against ruthlessly kick in the refugees' teeth and break their ribs. They are forced to endure the pain and humiliation of being beaten all over by middle road. Their noses are smashed in and their arms and legs are broken. The mothers and daughters who escaped North Korea are degraded party by Chinese brokers who traffic North Korean women. The parents who have left their children behind live in great pain, knowing that their children must live on the street as orphans. They shed tears of great sorrow and resentment with no country to call their own. Some younger North Korean women are dragged away by Chinese police and locked into dark windowless rooms, where they are forced into sexual slavery in front of webcams. It is said that Chinese men use cigarettes and hot spoons to burn the skin of North Korean women who do not obey their sexual demands. Women who try to rest, hiding beneath their blankets, are stomped on so severe that they almost die from internal bleeding. These women are then thrown in front of police station, left to die on the street. The organizers I lead, NKN USA, was able to rescue such women with the generous support of elderly Americans and Korean American church group, I would like to speak about the 17-year-old North Korean girl who has now resettled in the United States. She was arrested in China and forcibly repatriated while trying to escape. After bringing these security agents with Chinese money, she was released, succeeded in escape North Korea once again. However, because she could not speak Chinese, she was dragged away by human trafficker. She was repatriated and pursuably imprisoned. The broker then forced feed medication to this 17-year-old girl to induce abortion. This girl, who already survived, was rescued and through the United States. I would also like to speak about the heartbreaking story of the North Korean mothers. Her two children, one of them 2 years old and the other 3 years old, starved to death. After draining her children's next to her husband's grave, she left North Korea to find a way to survive. However, she became ensnared by human traffickers and repaid several times. She was forced to give birth to children whose fathers she did not know. One of the men she was sold to tried to sell the baby to another family, few earlies. That she would not give birth to his child, he beat her whenever he became drunk. I have spoken of only 2 of the many women that our organization was able to rescue. People, Republic of China countries to violate the refugee convention, assisting Kim Jong-un by forcibly repatriating North Korean refugee. Moreover, the Chinese border security unit in the Tumen country, Yanji, Liaoning province, treats North Korean refugee in the same way that the North Korean regime does. The guards torture and abuse the refugees after locking them up behind the bars. My family was also arrested for the supposed crime of helping North Korean escape and imprisoned for 1 year and 3 months. After making all the familiar prison in a cell stand in the line, they kicked and beat all of us one at one time. Even pregnant women, the elderly, and children are forced to squat for hours on end with their arms raised. Anyone who leaned on a wall out of exhaustion was beaten with the rubber club until they were bruised all over. The U.S. government and the international community cannot ignore the suffering and misery of North Korean regimes. It must not turn a blind eye of such unspeakable human rights violation taking place across China. I bear no ill will towards the Chinese people. I only speak the the wrongdoing of the Chinese government, which unknowingly returned North Korean refugees to certain death. Many of the individuals who brazenly treat North Korean women like animals and engage trafficking are also Chinese government officers. It is not bidding of countries that claim to be a great power to murder people and aided and bedding the appalling crime of trafficking women. The People's Republic of China must fully recognize its past wrongdoing. It must recognize the North Korean refugees who have been deprived of their freedom as refugees. Kim Jong-un and North Korean regime integrating crimes to its hopeless and absurd police cannot be allowed to exist any longer. If the Chinese government continues to cooperate with the North Korean regime, it will only become the object of scorn to the entire world. As stated in international law, our fellow North Korean brothers and sisters are refugees. I respectfully call upon the Chinese government to respect and abide by its obligation under international law. I would like to thank you, God, for granting me the freedom to speak my mind. I would like to ask all of you to not ignore our suffering by questions the truth of our stories. North Korean defectors, including myself, will continue to speak out until the day Kim Jong-un is brought to justice in an international court for his atrocious crimes. I would like to ask the United States Congress and the other world to listen to our voice and to help us in every way that you can. Thank you.
Ms. Joe, thank you very much for your testimony. We do have 5 votes that have been called on the floor of the House. It'll take about approximately 25 minutes. There's a 5-minute vote after this initial 15. So we will stand in recess for about 25 minutes. I apologize for the inconvenience. Then we'll come back and conclude. Maria, you'll be next, and then we'll go to questions. So I hope your calendars permit you to remain. We stand in recess.
problem.
Is it? all good.
But if you see Mark,
He's got the in?
yeah,
Okay.
he brought it from the back. We need it in the back. I know. Yeah.
So do one in early May, one in late May, and one in June.
I wanted to have a chance. I test career students here in September of 2016. That was completed. So there was nobody who followed the education in Monday put together a testimony that I sent to you because this was going on. It was systematic. It was not a one-time deal.
And nobody followed?
Nobody's followed up.
Would you be interested in publishing in our
Absolutely.
publication, HRNK Insider?
Absolutely.
It's online, but we really have an impact. The
Yeah.
recent report of the High Commission for Human Rights actually included a
Well,
piece from
what I
Insider.
would have to do is very quickly update what I have on what happened after the North Korea and
Yes.
Cuba relations and use the congressional testimony as basis because I don't have a lot of time, but I can do it.
Oh, please, by
Yeah.
all means, and if we can
Yeah.
use your congressional testimony, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So, did you give me your card?
I gave you
Yeah.
my card, and I'll give
Yeah.
you another one.
No, that's fine. Give me your card.
That is a
yeah.
fantastic idea.
I have it too.
You got it? Okay,
Yes.
great.
Yeah. So, can I give you my card?
You gave me yours as well.
I'll just send you the link so you can see it. I don't have, time or the staff to follow this issue, but I follow it somewhat. North Korea and Cuba, anything sort of update. They continue their ties and their friendship and stuff. And this is not a one-time deal. And then that's about the testimony. There's a testimony coming back from the Institute in Stockholm that I put the congressional committee in touch with. Who've been tracking maritime things and he has some really good
Who has get in touch with
Yeah.
my stock? By all means. Okay, to add to my credentials.
Absolutely.
Originally from Romania. I was
Oh,
born and raised in
really?
Germany.
Oh my goodness. Oh, I need to talk to you about that because let me run and maybe
Of course,
we can,
yeah.
It's always helpful.
Good. Can't call me a rookie anymore.
Yes.
What things are coming?
How long are you using this?
But I was asked to do that first.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
So, and I had another document too. So I started my testimony and working on my foundation. So it's
I'd love some creamery, but this is black.
I'll see if I can find. So what I wanted to tell you was that I wrote.
Please.
Sorry, I wrote a paper on the Castro, family's fortune, their wealth, and Fortune newspaper, Fortune magazine puts out all this, whatever, and Fidel Castro threw a major. This was in 2006. He got ill immediately after that. So I think I
You can take
contributed
credit,
to-
right?
But it was a big deal in Cuba.
Yes.
Inside Cuba and the diplomatic community and stuff. And I had collaborated with Forbes on this, but they had never done it publicly like that. And then I have a friend who is an expert in transitions in Eastern Europe who called me up and he said, I don't understand the reaction. And he says, that's because in Romania, Ceausescu, that's how they got him. They accused him of stealing, money from the patrimony. And that's when they executed him. And I have the transcript of the trial.
Yeah.
And that does come up.
Yes.
But I don't know, and I've never been to your country. Like I visited some others, but and I want to learn more because I think the Romanian situation has more to do with Cuba than the rest of the country.
It does, and there are so many similarities culturally, linguistically. I think they're definitely two countries that are very close together. I mean, it's
I need to, I just don't have time, but I'm fascinated by the process in Europe.
so, speaking of slush funds, yes, this is one of the accusations. Of course, it was a kangaroo tribunal.
Yeah.
The people who did this were not extraordinarily pleasant people themselves. They had to
Oh, and
do
they
it.
were probably stealing too, which is the case in Cuba.
Actually, it's really interesting that some of those who are managing the overseas funds of Ceausescu became the new multi-billionaires in the transition and the funds disappeared.
When did the report come out?
A miracle. A miracle.
I'm not sure. It's on our website.
In East Germany, they were able to recover a lot of the funds that were managed by the Stasi and, Rayburn. And they're funding, using those funds to fund the memory and, the educational issues, the putting the Stasi files in order.
I'm not sure.
I've been looking at that.
That's because the Federal Republic of Germany was in charge of the transitional process, but elsewhere, Romania especially, you had the same jokers in charge of the so-called post-communist transition. And, they let go because they realized that they would be the big winners of the transition and be inadequate. And there are really serious lessons to be learned for Cuba, for North Korea as well, and I'm a firm believer in a very serious transitional justice process. I'm not saying that everybody must be tried, but what I'm saying is that at least lustration for 10, 15, 20 years, they should be
And you
nowhere
didn't have
near.
any legislation bodies that were effective in
They were very, very lukewarm, and
That's
especially
really important. Are you based in the United States?
based in D.C., yes.
Would you like to come to a con? You don't speak Spanish, do you?
Unfortunately, I understand Spanish. I think that I speak Romanian and French. If I studied Spanish intensively for 6
It's very
months,
similar to French,
yes. Maybe if you ask me to study Spanish, I will, and I'll
I'm
bring
putting
myself
together
up to
a
speed.
seminar at a conference that I have to do with every August. It's the end of July in Miami. It's a little hot, but
Just got back from Key West.
oh,
Yes,
really?
yeah.
Nice.
It's
It's like 28th to 30th. And
I think so.
it's on,
Well,
I want
well,
somebody to speak
well,
on the
I think
transitional justice situation of the former Soviet bloc countries.
I would love to do that. I teach in South Korea for a month, and it's July the 15th to August the 15th. Perhaps we can try to Skype in. If you have the conference facilities, I don't know, we can talk about it.
If you do, if you can, I mean, that would be great if I can find somebody to do it. I would love that.
Yeah, the time difference is 14 hours. The Koreans are 14 hours ahead of us. So, say if it's at some point in the morning, I'm available this night or there. So.
That's wonderful. You know, I have to tell you, last year we had at this conference a delegation of like 15 Koreans, supposedly South Koreans, sort of looking at the process of reconciliation, going on in Cuba. Very suspicious stuff and very amazing. Like promoting like the unification of North and South Korea. Some academic. I have the whole folder
Do
they
you
gave
have
me.
business cards and names? Because I can
I
tell
do.
you
I
exactly who
do.
you're dealing
Oh,
with.
I would love
Oh,
that.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
The minute they had this seminar, and I raised my hand, and nobody mentioned the shipment, in contravention of the arms, and I thought that was strange. They mobbed me afterwards. They all came with cards. They wanted cards. Blah, blah. And then they invited a fellow to South Korea who was just, an American who
The hearing will resume, and again, I apologize for that lengthy delay because of the votes. I'd like to now introduce Maria Verlaw, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to offer this testimony. Please allow me a few words about the grave situation of Baptist pastor Mario Felix Leonard, husband and father of 2 children, arrested Sunday at noon, a few hours before President Obama arrived in Cuba. He's quite ill and suspicious of a needle prick he received in the arm from a stranger some days ago, after which he developed some puzzling symptoms that have worsened. I have photos of his arrest as well as of his arm. His wife is under arrest. I've been in communication with her through her cell phone. The pastor has refused to eat or drink since yesterday morning. He does not feel safe in Cuba, and I believe he's not safe in Cuba, where several activists have died in the state-run facilities in questionable circumstances and surrounded by the secret police. I call on President Obama and Secretary Kerry to request his immediate release and that he be brought to the United States with his family for immediate medical treatment, hopefully with our huge official delegation or before it leaves Cuba. Now, on the topic of this hearing, I will speak about Cuba based on considerable research over the last 6 years on human trafficking and exploitation. Let me briefly address some key issues the committee is considering. 1, what is Cuba's track record, particularly in the last year, in fighting human trafficking? I consider 4 main sources of human trafficking in Cuba. 1 is the export services of temporary workers. 2, forced labor and sex trafficking. 3, state-sponsored or forced migration. And 4, the export sale of human and body parts. Cuba derives most of its revenues from the export services of temporary workers and forced migration. Our State Department's Trafficking in Persons report addressed only 2 of these aspects for Cuba, and in my view, disappointingly, they do not pay attention to the other 2. Contrary to fighting human trafficking, the Cuban government is itself likely one of the largest and most profitable traffickers in the world. This business has been growing enormously and exponentially, especially in the last 10 years. What makes the Cuban case unique as well as astounding is that trafficking is a huge operation run through numerous state enterprises, which, for the most part, accomplices, participants, sponsors, and promoters all over the world, including from well-known corporations, large foundations, key international agencies, and some of the leading world democracies, including ours as of late. Regarding the export labor force, it is quite diversified and consists of generally highly qualified temporary workers, doctors and other health professionals, teachers, sports trainers, engineers, construction workers, entertainers, sailors, scientists, architects, engineers, etc. They can be dispatched overseas at short notice and are oftentimes sent as part of labor brigades. The greater part of their wages go to the Cuban government. Many different services are sold through large state entities, including 2 very large health conglomerates and 84 smaller state entities. It is a huge and expanding business. The latest official data for the year 2011 indicates that Cuba's export services net of tourism grew from $1.5 billion in 2003 to $7.8 billion in 2011. Last year, reports from Cuban officials put the annual figure at around $8.2 billion. From tourism, Cuba derives, to give you a comparative idea, $2.5 billion a year. So it's almost 3 times, or it's over 3 times. It's impossible to tell how many Cuban workers are involved from conflicting official reports, but around 65,000, perhaps more, are said to serve in 91 countries. 75% of those, or close to 50,000, are in the health sector. This is according to different reports from Cuban officials. It's not official data published. Cuba's business of exporting indentured workers and its unique brand of health diplomacy are only possible in a totalitarian state in which a pool of guaranteed captive, low-paid workers can be exploited as exportable commodities. Violations are too numerous to list here, but amply documented in my published work and more detailed in my written testimony. In my mind, there is no doubt the practice constitutes a form of slavery and violates many international agreements to which Cuba and most countries where these workers serve as parties, including the trafficking protocols. Regarding state-sponsored or forced migration, this is not a usual form of human trafficking by its state per se, but it is taking place at a very large scale and results from direct and indirect practices of the Cuban state that force, push, and/or enable its desperate citizens to migrate in the tens of thousands each year. It alleviates political and economic pressure on the government and generates billions in revenues from assorted fees and assistance from the ever-growing diaspora, which just from the United States alone is estimating to be sending over $5 billion a year. I have anecdotal evidence of elaborate criminal schemes run covertly by operatives or agents of the regime that merit further investigation by the appropriate authorities. I understand that certain U.S. law enforcement agencies have looked into this and have specific cases under investigation. The mass migration has been fueled in recent years by three factors. One, a huge outflow through Ecuador, a close ally of Cuba, starting in 2008, whereby thousands have made and are making their way north by land into the United States, where they are mostly automatically admitted. Two, by changes to Cuba's migration law beginning January 2013, permitting travel without an exit permit. And three, beginning in 2009, by the Obama administration's comprehensive relaxation of travel and remittance regulations under the embargo. I estimate that in 2015 alone, at least 92,000 Cubans were admitted into the United States, 43,159 during fiscal year 2015 by all points of entry without prior entry visas. Since 2008, at least 325,000 Cubans have come, with the trend rising exponentially in the last few years. With those numbers, we can only imagine that revenues will only grow for the regime to solidify itself and continue repressing. Regarding forced labor and sex trafficking, the following are also taking place in Cuba. The prostitution of girls just 16 years old on the streets, but also in schools with the participation of teachers and even the complicity of authorities, apparently maintained to increase Cuba's attraction as a tourism destination. The uncompensated labor of prisoners, and child labor, particularly in agricultural fields. The government states that this is voluntary labor. Because most Cuban workers, migrants, minors put to work, and prostitutes seemingly consent to the practice for different reasons, this doesn't mean that it's not trafficking. It's important to clarify that the trafficking in persons protocol states the consent of the victim to the intended exploitation is irrelevant once it is demonstrated that deception, coercion, force, or other prohibited means have been used. In addition, the definition of trafficking in person includes the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person for the purpose of exploitation. Finally, number 4, Cuba has been exporting, at least since 1995, an average of $30 million a year in blood products in international markets, mostly, it seems, to state entities within the countries that are close allies. This is done without consent from volunteer or coerced donors in Cuba, tricked into believing their donations are for altruistic purposes. In the 1960s, Cuba drained the blood from prisoners awaiting execution including at least one American, Robert Fuller, in October of 1960. It reportedly sold it to countries such as Vietnam. We at Cuba Archive have also published reports of the sale by Cuba to Brazil rising to around $80 million in 2013 of human tissue glands and other body parts of unknown origin, as well as unreported cases of suspected deaths or the plundering of bodies to harvest body parts that are suggestive of state sponsorship. We strongly encourage our government and that of other countries to investigate this. The committee also seeks to examine, are there glaring gaps in prosecuting traffickers, preventing trafficking, or protecting victims? Because in this case, the main perpetrator of the trafficking is in fact the Cuban state, directly or indirectly. Rather than gaps, I see a huge black hole into which the victims fall systematically and mostly hopelessly with little international awareness or support. In Cuba, there is no legal protection for victims or individual or collective rights outside of those allowed by the Communist Party. What's worse, these victims serve a dictatorship all around the world in blatant violation of international law is an open, accepted, and even encouraged fact. Few international mechanisms of protections and redress have been put in place. Some of the temporary workers find safe haven in the countries where they serve, and especially health professionals to the U.S. under the Cuban Medical Professional Parole Program since 2006 that has welcomed 7,117 applicants through 2015. The program, which Cuba fiercely denounces, is under review now as part of the normalization of our bilateral relations with Cuba. Meanwhile, we, our own government, our own country, has started to support or cooperate with Cuba's medical brigades in Haiti and last year in the West African countries fighting Ebola. As we have seen above, it is hard to understand how any informed analysis of Cuban reality could lead to the conclusion that Cuba has improved its record of human trafficking. My written testimony is much more extensive and includes substantive data. I respectfully request that it be taken into consideration and entered into the record. Thank you.
Ms. Villalobos, thank you very much for your testimony. Without objection, your statement and all of the others will be made a part of the record in their entirety, as I indicated earlier. Let me ask you, begin first with Ambassador Legon. And again, thank you for your extraordinary insights on Cuba. And I think your testimony is the most expansive, authoritative that we've had years to date. And I have, as Ambassador Legon knows, chaired dozens of these hearings, both while we were preparing the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and two of its follow-ons that I authored, and the oversight hearings that we held both before and after the tip reports were handed down by state that you have provided. I've read the tip report for Cuba as well as the other countries in question. There is much that you have suggested be included that they need to seriously take under their wings, including that statement you said about the child sex tourism and the confidential report by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, in which you said ratify that Cuba is one of the primary tourist destinations for sex tourism that includes minors of both genders. It appears that the child prostitution rings are maintained and promoted to increase Cuba's attraction as a tourism destination. Over 1 million Canadians, you point out, visit Cuba each year. And Ambassador Legon, you might want to speak on this as well, because when Cuba was a Tier 3, obviously we knew much of this. We didn't have that report was occurring. I remember being at the UN Human Rights Council with a great leader of Cuban human rights who had actionable information about what was happening with child sex tourism in Cuba. And as a result of this, some Cuban thugs knocked him out. A van pulled up and hit him right in the jaw and knocked him out. And I mean, so this is a land of the Gulag and a Potemkin village as well. And it's about time our State Department and our president takes seriously this substantive information. So you have provided that, and you might want to speak to that, Ambassador Legon. I would also ask you if you would, you were the one who made sure that the TIP report finally, at long last, looked at the gendercide that has occurred in China and the missing girls in China, and we are talking about tens of millions of girls who are the victims of sex-selected abortion, and the disparity, which is again noted in this year's TIP report, of 117 boys to 100 girls. It happens nowhere else except perhaps in India, but it's not the normal process. They are exterminated because they are girls, but it has led to the consequence of sex trafficking that has grown exponentially as that lack of or that dearth of women in the country have just set up this skewed sex male to female ratio. If you would speak to that, Ambassador Legon, and because it's not getting better in China, it appears to be getting worse. I spoke recently at Shanghai NYU in Shanghai, and I spoke extensively to the issue of the missing girls and the nexus of that with trafficking. If you could also speak to Vietnam, there was a great deal of hope by some that when there was a rapprochement with Vietnam, when the trade deal was consummated with Vietnam, the bilateral trade agreement, that human rights might break out. I was a skeptic at the time. Sadly, my skepticism has been affirmed as they are in a race to bottom with China and places like North Korea when it comes to human rights in general, trafficking, particularly labor trafficking in Vietnam, if you could speak to that. And finally, Ambassador Legon, China had 35 convictions, a land of 1.2 billion people with a huge labor and sex trafficking problem. As we know, the reform through labor elimination has not happened, and I've been in one of those camps, Beijing Prison Number 1, where 40 Tiananmen Square activists were held and forced to labor. They have just turned them and put a different sign out in front, and they continue to use that exploitation, and yet that's not reflected in China's tier having gotten the passing grade. But China had 35 convictions. Thailand, a tier 3 country, had 151. Cuba, 13 convictions, and Malaysia, a mere 3, dropping from 9 the previous year to 3. So they even trended in the wrong direction. So Thailand has been singled out as tier 3. And of course, convictions is not the only barometer, but it's certainly a very useful one. And yet, Malaysia, China, and Cuba, just to name 3, have far less in terms of convictions, and yet they got watch list. Could you try to explain that for us?
Sure. And a welcome set of homework assignments to address on these. Cuba, first of all. I said in my testimony, and a bit more elaborately in the written version, that one of the reasons that I think the ranking for Cuba in last year's report was suspect is this proactive effort to sell the sex market in Cuba to an international buyer base. I wrote a piece in the Washington Post on February the 1st saying that it's time to address the sex trafficking issue through dealing with demand. And it's one thing when there are so-called Johns that are let off the hook while those who are in prostitution or who are trafficked are punished. But when a state is involved in a proactive policy to encourage people to travel and treat women as commodities, it is a hazard zone for trafficking. As for Vietnam, Vietnam is part of a picture of a U.S. policy of cultivating relationships with illiberal states that are ostensibly moving in the right direction to counterbalance China. I'm all in favor of working to dialogue with Malaysia, to dialogue with Myanmar, to dialogue with Vietnam in that context. U.S. foreign policy should not let such nations off the hook on human rights we need to look very carefully at Vietnam. Corruption, limits on free press and civil society, lack of basic protections for migrants entering into Vietnam and leaving them, these make for great dangers for human trafficking. And Vietnam has had a Tier 2 ranking for 4 years, and it's really worth asking whether the implementation is going farther. I had the honor of hosting the Deputy Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, to speak at a conference we had on democracy promotion at Freedom House in October. He noted he loves working with Freedom House and expected me to be a scold. I was on Vietnam, because the picture he portrayed is really rosier than is deserved. Now, on China, first of all, with respect to the population policy and a second important factor, the treatment of North Korean refugees, they're drivers that make for a danger for gendered human trafficking, namely the longstanding population policy of limiting the number of children, and then both policy and culture favoring male babies has created this kind of insidious form of the gender gap. And even if population policy appears to be moving in the right direction, in that there is somewhat more choice for people to choose having more than one child, there's still a big residual problem that's a driver of sex trafficking and the kind of human trafficking that is bride sales. But when it's combined with the treatment of North Koreans, not as refugees, but as economic migrants, who, if sent back to North Korea, as my colleague on the panel here indicated, would be punished. That together creates a situation of a danger for sex trafficking. Finally, number of convictions. I have said here and elsewhere that despite the great wisdom that you and others had in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the rather similar Palermo Protocol, there's a heavy emphasis on convictions in those. Oftentimes, some of the most illiberal states in the world overinterpret that, and they have what one might call the cruel law and order version of an anti-human trafficking policy. Malaysia, China, these are the very states that you would expect to tilt towards a law enforcement approach over a survivor re-empowerment policy. But China's conviction rate is utterly anemic, as you say, and taken with the problems of people, when they move to opportunities in the city, losing their social services, and the gender disproportion that you were raising, and the fact that the so-called elimination of the reform through labor policy as a chimera, I think China deserves great scrutiny and it ought not to be given a pass in the report.
Ambassador Legon, thank you very much. Mr. Smith, what would happen if Burma did receive a downgrade, especially would it affect the military? As you point out, and I couldn't concur more with your statement that Malaysia and Burma need to be downgraded just based on the record. I mean, the record is overwhelming, and hopefully state will look at your analysis as well, because I think you lay it out in great detail. But what would happen, especially in Burma, because even though we know the impact that the military has on that country.
Yes, I think that if Burma or Myanmar is downgraded to Tier 3, this would send a very clear message to the military that it needs to shape up with regard to human trafficking, that forced labor is completely unacceptable, and that they have to do more. I think there may be those voices out there who would suggest that a downgrade for Myanmar would somehow disrupt the political transition. We would disagree with that notion. Myanmar's people have struggled very long and hard to ensure the forces of democracy move forward in the country. But apart from that, I think, as I mentioned before, the situation now has the optics of democracy, but there is a certain authoritarian system still at play in the country. And the military has ensured that the democracy that does take hold, that they have a very active role in that. So I guess in short, a downgrade for Myanmar would send a very clear message to the military that it needs to cooperate with the new NLD government to combat human trafficking, and we feel like that would be the wisest course of action. Thank you.
Last year's TIP report noted that the demobilization of some 376 child soldiers from the military. But does the military's practice of recruiting child soldiers continue? Is it a replacement? Or have some of those kids perhaps aged out?
The use and recruitment of child soldiers throughout the country does continue, unfortunately. This is continuing not only within the Myanmar Army, but also within the border guard forces and the non-state ethnic armies. Conflict right now is continuing, particularly in the north of the country. And as a result, both the ethnic armies and the Myanmar Army, the Burma Army, are seeking to increase their troop strength. And in this sort of perverse recruitment process, they believe that enlisting children within the military somehow helps them achieve that objective. There's been little to no accountability. In fact, last year, the Myanmar authorities only prosecuted one civilian for the recruitment of children, and the recruitment process is happening throughout the country.
Let me ask you with regards to Malaysia's plan to deal with the thousands of Rohingya refugees being detained in IDCs. Have the refugees been screened for trafficking, as far as you know, and why are NGOs and the UNHCR not allowed to visit them?
No, sir, we do not believe that they have been screened for human trafficking. And while Malaysia was getting some international praise for finally allowing people who were stranded at sea to disembark, they did shuffle them very quickly to detention where they remain today. As far as we understand, there is no good reason why the UNHCR or other service providers would not have access. And one additional concern is that refugees, asylum seekers in Malaysia, many of whom have endured horrific experiences of human trafficking, now have a very difficult time registering with the UNHCR, and this opens them up to other forms of exploitation.
And one final question on Malaysia. As I noted, 3 convictions, down from 9 the year before. And I would agree with Ambassador Legon, the other aspects of the TIP initiative, prevention, prosecution, and protection are all extremely important, mutually reinforcing provisions of a coordinated strategy. But it is easier to obviously, if you're serious about law enforcement, you need to look at convictions, and it's only 3 for Malaysia. But my question, the State Department upgraded Malaysia last year in part for a trafficking victim pilot program. Many of us think it was all about the TPP, but give them, they think that's something they should have emphasized, that allowed victims to leave shelter and detention and work. However, subsequent information has shown that exactly none of the 4 victims who were cleared to participate in that program were able to do so, mostly because of the Malaysian government's failures. Are you aware of any victims free to leave detention and participate in a work pilot program?
We are not aware that that is occurring in Malaysia at all.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Ms. Zhou, if I could. The Chinese government has signed the Refugee Convention. I and others on this subcommittee have repeatedly asked the Chinese to honor the provisions of that Refugee Convention, that treaty, and not send people back to North Korea, where they are usually either killed or certainly sent to prison again. And the trafficking piece of it is obviously, and we've had several witnesses previously who have actually been trafficked, who told their stories before the subcommittee. They made it across the line into China, thought they were home free, only to find that they were then subjected to the cruelty of modern-day slavery. And I'm wondering, has there been any diminution of the exploitation of trafficking? Because it seems like they get hurt either way. If they're sent back to North Korea, they are incarcerated or killed, and if they stay in China, they are trafficked. Has it gotten any better, or is it still as bad as it has been?
설명을 해주십시오.
3일 전에 제가 이제 북한 쪽하고 전화 통화를 했을 때, 또 중국에 있는 사람들이나 탈북자들하고 통화를 했을 때, 제가 2006년도에 마지막에 북한을 나왔는데 중국을 떠난 게 2008년도고, 그때야 지금이 전혀 변하지 않았다는 것을 먼저 말씀드리고 싶고요.
Just 3 days ago, I had a phone conversation with some North Koreans currently residing in China, and compared to the time I left North Korea or compared to the time I left China in 2008, they tell me that there has been no change.
그리고 북한 내부에 지금 있자면 장사할 수 있는 길이나 또 뭐 그 어떤 블랙 마켓에서 돈을 모아서 장사를 하려고 해도 돈이 필요하기 때문에 중국에 와서 얻어가야 되기 때문에 사람들이 탈출을 하는데, 중국에 와서 잡혔을 때 북송되는 부분, 도문변방 구류 심사소라는 감옥 안에 보면 지난 18년 전에 만들어진 그 감옥에는 중국 사람들과 똑같은 대우를 하지 않기 위해서 탈북자들만 딸로 가다 놓은 곳이 있습니다. 그것도 여전히 지금 운영이 되고 있고 북한하고 똑같은 방식으로 운영이 되고 있습니다.
Basically, what we know about North Koreans today is that there are some black market activities and people can make money out of these black market activities. However, in order to be involved in these markets, they do need money, they do need capital. In order to do that, they have to cross the border into China. If they're apprehended by the Chinese authorities, they're subjected to very aggressive interrogation and very aggressive treatment. They're actually separated from the regular Chinese prison population, and they're subjected to treatment that is in many ways similar to the treatment that they suffer if they're forcibly returned to North Korea.
그리고 올해 1월 달부터 지금 현재까지 저희가 구출한 탈북자 여성 수만 13명입니다. 13명 중에 북송된 탈북자, 저희가 모금이 되지 않아서 돈이 없어서 구출을 못한 탈북 여성 2명이 북송이 됐습니다. 보입에서 끌려나갔고 지금까지도 단련대라는 곳으로 이송이 되지 않았습니다. 그거를 봤을 때 이 사람은 보이부에서 처형이 됐거나 한국을 가려다가 들켰다는 걸로 정치범 수용소에 끌려갔거나 둘 중에 하나라고 볼 수 있습니다.
Since January of this year, we have been able to rescue 13 North Koreans. Most unfortunately, 2 out of them, 2 North Korean women, as far as we know, were forcibly returned to North Korea, where they were subjected to interrogation by the State Security Department. This is North Korea's main internal security agency. They were sent to a so-called mobile labor brigade, and as far as we know, they may as well have been sent to a political prison camp because it was disclosed during the interrogation that they came across, for example, South Koreans.
그리고 현재 구출해 달라고 도움을 요청한 분들은 4명이 한 조로 한국을 떠나서 오는 길에 중국하고 다른 나라 북경에서 체포되었습니다. 그리고 중국에서부터 북한까지 나가는데 보통 저희가 계산하기로는 25일을 계산하는데 지금 17일 만에 북한 땅으로 이송이 됐습니다. 그리고 그 절차 모든 게 지난 제가 북한을 떠나고 중국을 떠나기 전과 지금이 똑같습니다.
So basically, there's a group of 4 who need rescue, who are apprehended. We know that the time that it takes to return apprehended North Korean refugees from China to North Korea is 25 days. It used to be about 17 days. As you can see, there isn't such a big difference compared to the time when I was there.
In the tip report that we have under scrutiny today, where China falsely was given a watch list designation, it is clear, they point out that Chinese women and girls are subjected to sex trafficking within China. They are typically recruited from rural areas and taken to urban centers. Well-organized criminal syndicates and local gangs play key roles in the trafficking of Chinese women and girls in China. Victims are recruited with fraudulent employment opportunities and subsequently forced into prostitution. Girls from Tibet, autonomous regions, are reportedly sent to other parts of China and subjected to forced marriage and domestic servitude. And it goes on with more a tale of indictment, really, about how China is dealing with it. Then we get to the protection part. It says the government did not undertake adequate efforts to protect victims and did not directly provide data on the number of victims identified or assisted in services it provided. And yet they didn't get tier 3. I mean, it's almost comical, except that it's a tragedy. My question to you is, are there any services that you know of for either indigenous Chinese women or refugees if they are identified as a trafficking victim? And you mentioned in your testimony that Chinese government officials are involved in the trafficking of women. Are they making profits over that cruelty, or are they just grossly indifferent?
아시다시피 중국은 Tier 2 비율, 그러니까 감시 대상국으로 지금 분류되어 있는데요. 조진혜 선생께서 아시기로는 혹시 인신매매 피해자들을 위한 그러한 서비스나 복지가 있는지, 그리고 또 중국 공안에서 일하는 공무원들은 인신매매에 참여하는 것인지, 또한 만약에 중국 공무원들이 그러한 인신매매에 참여한다면 이득을 얻는 것인지, 거기에 대해서 좀 말씀을 해주십시오.
네, 저희가 탈북자들이 이제 북한을 떠나서 국경을 넘어서 중국의 인신매매 팔려가는 단계에서 중국이 굉장히 탈북자 검거를 강화를 했기 때문에 많은 곳에서 경비를 서고 있고 차단봉을 내려놓고 사람 한 명 한 명을 검사를 합니다. 그렇기 때문에 보통 사람의 힘으로서는 그곳을 통과할 수가 없습니다. 그래서 경찰들이 중국 공안들이 돈을 벌기 위해서 경찰차라든가 자기네 신분증을 가지고 위장을 해서 이 사람들을 통과를 시킵니다. 그렇기 때문에 경찰들이 여기에 가입이 돼 있고 돈을 벌고 있습니다.
The surveillance in the border areas has been increased. There are numerous roadblocks, there are numerous searches. Frankly, it is impossible for an ordinary individual to get through all of these checkpoints and roadblocks. And
알아서 경찰을 찾아서
actually, in our case as well, we paid one of the locals to help us out, and they told us that they got in touch with the local cops, the local law enforcement agents who participated in the process and ensured that we got out.
그리고 중국 내에는 인신매매를 당하고 있는 여자나 아이들을 보호하는 단체라든가 그런 걸 도와주는 곳이 없습니다. 다만 한국에 있는 아니면 미국에 있는 미셔너리 목사님들이 현장에서 그런 전화를 받고 도와주고 또 저희 단체 같은 사람들하고 연결이 돼서 돈을 주고 구출을 해내오는 그런 방식밖에는 보호할 수 있는 길이 없습니다.
There are no Chinese groups, institutions, or organizations that rescue women or children who are victimized by human traffickers. The only ones who do this are American or South Korean missionaries who make phone calls and invest in this operation of rescuing victims of human trafficking.
Ambassador Legon, does that comport with what you knew as ambassador at large during your time and currently now as head of Freedom House?
Yeah, the problem in China is a tilt away from victim services in general. For those who are North Koreans, it's not only China's flagrant failure to live up to its obligations under the Refugee Convention, but also a lack of existing help. You know, in the region, some of the best equipped countries, such as Japan, have not stepped up to the plate to provide the fullest of victim services, such as translation for women who are in shelters who are trafficking victims. But we're talking about a truly anemic null set in terms of helping the victims, particularly those who are Koreans.
Thank you. Let me ask Ms. Fairlaw, and before I go, I just want to note that in the past, we had a number of hearings. Suzanne Schulte actually brought some unbelievable witnesses. They were believable because they were, but it was just astonishing to hear them speak of their ordeal coming out of North Korea into China. And one of those witnesses talked about a mother and a daughter. The daughter left, was trafficked. The mother went looking for her, and she was trafficked. And only by the grace of God and some very humane people were both of them able to find freedom. But it was harrowing in terms of the experiences that they relayed to our subcommittee previously. So I want to thank Ms. Schulte for arranging that in the past. It was extraordinary. And again, it's unabated, unchanged, as Ms. Joe just said. Ms. Verlaw, if I could address some of the Cuban issues. The Trafficking Victims Report says the government took no action to address forced labor. As if you say you're going to do nothing and take no action, it doesn't exist, which is foolish beyond words. And yet they were upgraded from Tier 3 to watch list. So my question, if you could speak to it, you did in your testimony, but it would be worth some reiteration, because you did speak about the whole issue of doctors and others being compelled and the huge profits gleaned for the Cuban government. What happens if a physician or a health professional says, no, I'm not going to be deployed somewhere around the world? And how much money does this actually bring into the government by forcing them to do so?
Sorry, let me preface this by saying that for 2 years in a row, the State Department Office for Trafficking in Persons has called me to inquire specifically about the situation of the doctors. And I have had long conversations that are partly reflected in the report, but they sustain for 2 years in a row that these are allegations. And I have interviewed dozens of doctors who don't know each other, who've served in different countries, that repeat the same thing over and over. We have more than 7,000 testimonies taken in our embassies all over the world. And, you know, before these visas are issued for the Cuban Medical Professional Parole Program, these people are interviewed. So I've told them, go, you know, to the embassies or just get on a plane and go to Miami and find, you know, doctors walking around. They will tell you that this is not an allegation. This is happening systematically. So I'm dumbfounded by this approach.
So they're hiding in plain sight.
I mean, there's thousands of these doctors all over the world enduring these conditions and this situation. And the report it says that the Cuban government is the dominant employer. What it doesn't say is that it's a sole employer of medical professionals. So these people have no choice. But you were asking about what happens if doctors refuse to serve. I've asked about that, and some doctors have told me that they're punished, they're sent to a little clinic in the mountains, et cetera. But most doctors want to serve, and there's a corruption going on within the state mechanisms employed to recruit these doctors, because certain destinations are more palatable than others. It's certainly better to go to Portugal or Uruguay or, you know, even some areas of Brazil than to go to the jungle in, you know, Central America or remote areas of Africa. So actually, again, I mean, this goes back to these people want to serve because they want to improve their lot in life, and whereas a doctor in Cuba earns around $60 a month, then they get a little bonus in hard currency. They're able to see the world. They're able to, you know, save some money to repair the roof in their house when they come back. They get certain rewards, et cetera. So it's a unique situation.
Just ask you with regards to the child sex tourism. The newest law that just has been signed is called the International Megan's Law. And it does a number of things, but the first thing, it takes our database of Megan's Law, and every state has it. And anyone who seeks to travel, if he or she, and they're almost all men, is a convicted sex offender, we notice the country of destination within about 3 weeks of that departure, and the penalty for not giving us that, us being the U.S. government, that information is very significant, up to 10 years in prison. And if they travel, at least the country can either deny a visa or be very much more vigilant about their presence because the propensity to recommit these crimes is very high. It also establishes the hope within this administration and the next one to set up a reciprocity so we know when these folks are traveling to the United States. That's now law. It's not a bill, it's a law. And the hope is that now that there's an opening with Cuba, that when anyone seeks to travel to Cuba, we know it's been a destination for child sex tourism. The man I mentioned earlier, Frank Calzone, the one that was knocked out by a sucker punch, he had serious documentation of this. And my hope is that our new embassy will be robust, aggressive in trying to track down the parameters of this horrific entanglement of pimps and the government, often one and the same, and does not whitewash it, which I'm very worried that they may do. So if you would speak to the issue of child sex tourism and sex tourism in general to Cuba.
That's not my area of expertise. However, I have read about it, talked to people about it, and I reference in my written testimony an amazing documentary that was filmed in Cuba and that has great evidence, and everybody should see. The person who filmed it was then put in prison by Cuba, and it took several years before the Spanish government was able to get him out. So this is happening, and he has the evidence, and I think it's a horrific thing that is only going to probably increment with the increase in tourism that we're seeing in Cuba. And now, you know, probably people from the United States will be participants, as the Italians, Canadians, and others that are going to Cuba for this.
Thank you. I'd like to yield to our distinguished colleague, Congressman Clausen from Florida.
Sorry for being late. I had some other, you know how it is, with a double, triple booking. Got another one waiting on for me. Thank you for coming. I wanted to express, and I'm sorry I missed it, so what I'm going to say and your reaction is probably going to be redundant from what's already been said today. Of course, I support the chairman in his efforts to reduce, eliminate trafficking globally. Like a lot of things in this world, I feel like the economic power of the United States could have a bigger influence than it actually does. Whether it's in these matters, whether it's stealing intellectual property, which of course is nowhere near as serious as what we're talking about today, or anything else. If we're almost a third of the global GDP and everybody wants to have access to our markets, if we really wanted those folks that wanted access to our markets to eliminate trafficking, I believe that they could do so. And my view has always been, as I've studied up on this for Chris's committee, that to the extent that we allow folks that aren't serious about ending trafficking to participate in our marketplace, we send a message that's not even a mixed message, but rather, if you're an important spot economically for us, as in one of these trade deals, or if you're an important spot in terms of global diplomacy, meaning in the Middle East or in Cuba, then none of these things about trafficking really matter to us. And therefore, what is the message that we send around the world to victims of this, and whether we really care? And so I wanted to make sure that I showed up today, and maybe that summary is off in some way, but I'd like to hear what y'all's response is, and, you know, in context of what's going on in Cuba today, or the trade deal, or even the Iranian deal, it just seems to me that our interest and our commitment to stopping trafficking always takes a back seat when something important comes diplomatically, either for trade or for other things that the administration might think is important. Ambassador, you want to start? Am I wrong? Is there something about, am I overstating the problem here, or my position on this?
First of all, I agree with the premise that one has to look at this as a phenomenon in a market, and where something heinous is going on. I don't believe that globalization inevitably needs to lead to slavery, but it requires open eyes. And I think we're in this mode in the United States, and we feel this very strongly at Freedom House, that we somehow think we have less influence than we
have
actually
more.
have.
We have more, right?
And this is a situation where the driver of human trafficking is the fact that for the trafficker, whether it's the recruiter or the person who is locking someone in a brothel or someone who is actually supervising forced labor, that person feels that they can make huge profits off the backs of enslaved people, essentially enslaved people, and have very little prospect of being punished. That's a market force. We need to change that, make it more likely that they will be punished. And while labor trafficking is 75% of the incidence of trafficking overall in the world, more money is made on the backs of those who are sex trafficked. And you see both of these phenomena in places like Thailand, Cambodia, and so on.
Can I jump in on you for a minute?
Sure.
Now, if I were running a manufacturing business exporting from the Midwest, I would say, in addition to what you said, folks from Midwest factories lose their good-paying jobs, and we pay an economic price, at least an economic fairness price, if you will, in our country, while cheaters who may cheat in trafficking or any other way that they can cheat get an economic transfer of welfare in some other country. Is that right? So there's losers here and there, and
Well, it should be
all for a cheaper product, by the way.
should be particularly galling to American citizens if they see jobs being exported elsewhere, if it's to a place where there's not only kind of cheap labor or even exploitative labor, but in fact trafficked labor. I will say, and I said this earlier, that I favor the Trans-Pacific Partnership and TTIP, but you need to do it with open eyes. So Malaysia being kept viable to be part of the TPP as a reason or a rationale for its ranking in the TIP report makes no sense to me. I'm in favor of appropriately negotiated bilateral trade deals. But I noticed when I served as the anti-human trafficking ambassador that there were opportunities the United States was completely throwing out the window to place leverage on states we were forming bilateral free trade arrangements with, including in the Gulf.
Can I ask you a question? Is there any example that you can think of where we have used our economic leverage, 30% of global GDP, to force people to behave with respect to trafficking, human rights,
Sure.
religious freedom? And
Sure, and your colleague sitting in the chair helped invent it. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act creates a situation where there's sanctions or threatened sanctions for Tier 3 countries.
right, but most of the time in practicality it just gets ignored, or am I
Yeah, this
wrong?
is true.
That's what, I mean, my
Chairman
point is,
Smith has-
we yak about it up here. We have all the power as the United States of America. We're the driver of global trade, and people that cheat and therefore hurt kids, women, whoever,
We
don't do anything about it.
We have the leverage. I've noted before, the political scientists Beth Simmons at Harvard and Judith Kelly at Duke have shown that, in fact, the TIP report gets countries to change their laws. One case I can think of moving a country was Cambodia being faced with Tier 3 ranking and thinking that it would, having just gotten the introduction of forms of American aid, it would get cut off. Now, I entirely agree with a long-standing critique offered by Chairman Smith that the sanctions on Tier 3 countries are not used, and it's appalling. But that's an example of leverage working. Actually, you know, there are many examples. I am personally an advocate of the global Magnitsky sanctions legislation, which would target officials who are responsible for corruption and for human rights abuses. That really makes it painful for the people who are responsible. So you can, as you argue, place overall pressure in using leverage on a country, but you also can make life miserable for those.
Let me interrupt just for a minute, Ambassador. You would agree with me that there's a whole lot of countries that run trade surpluses with us that abuse their people, correct?
True.
Okay, then we're not doing very well. Okay, now let me go to Cuba. Does any of the witnesses here believe that the opening, the economic awakening, opening, whatever we want to call it with Cuba right now, is that going to help or hurt in efforts for folks to get treated in a humane, dignified way?
If I may begin, but I really want to defer to
Right.
my colleague, Ms. Warlaw. I think that the record is clear that there have not been changes since the diplomatic opening in human rights in general. Anything more than the most minor economic reforms haven't changed a whit. At this, a predecessor hearing held by Chairman Smith, looking at those, rankings that were considered politicized in the 2015 report, we heard witnesses from the State Department say, now there's more information available from Cuba because we're having diplomatic dialogue with them. So we have better information and we can tell that they're Tier 2 watch list rather than Tier 3. I think that's rich.
Ms. Joe? Thank you, Ambassador.
Respond on Cuba? Yes. Congressman, I have long favored exchanges that make sense and policies that advance the interests of the United States, and have for a long time argued that our policy towards Cuba, which I consider schizophrenic and contradictory in many aspects of it, different aspects of it, needed a revision. However, I strongly feel that lending credibility, legitimacy, and impunity to a criminal dictatorship without conditions and making unilateral concessions is very troubling and counterproductive to our own interests. The idea that commercial engagement, and including tourism, is going to bring about reforms in Cuba has already been tried. First, by the rest of the world that has been investing, trading, and sending tourists to Cuba for over 20 years since the fall of the Soviet bloc and massive subsidies, and Cuba had to restructure its economy, et cetera. For example, more than 1 million Canadian tourists go to Cuba every year, and this has been going on for years. I don't see a whole lot of difference between Canadian and US tourists. And second, because there have been, for years, many exceptions to the embargo, including from 1988, the Berman Amendment that has allowed the free sale and exchange of informational material, videos, music, artwork, et cetera. No Cubans can buy directly from the United States. It's the same thing with the agricultural products and medical products that have been exempt since 2000. The government, the Cuban government, controls all those imports from the United States.
Let me interrupt for just a so are you saying there's going to be more or less trafficking of kids and women, et cetera, with what we're doing now? More or less?
My prediction is more, because there will be more tourists and we'll be participating. And it's one state that is behind, I described the judicial system.
So the Melia hotel chain from Spain on Varadero Beach and other places has not done anything but make the problem. I'm not disputing it, I'm just making sure we're clear.
I have found no instance of any reform from those exchanges.
And if a representative of Obama administration were here today, he would say, what we've done ain't working, so if we try this, you would be wrong and the rest of the folks up here would be wrong. Is that right?
Well, I think that what we've done was not working. As I said, the policy had many contradictions. It was schizophrenic, and we were not able or not interested in pushing a multilateral approach that makes sense with our allies and partners, other democracies that would like to see and would benefit from having a stable and prosperous Cuba.
Anybody else, anything to add? Anything I'm missing here?
I don't know about the Cuba, that's why I cannot answer your question, but I hope North Korea can become open So yeah, if you're asking something for North Korea, and I love to answer it. Yeah.
And go ahead, since we were, tell us about what you, if we were to open more trade with North Korea, in your opinion, would that be more or less?
만약에 무역이나 경제적으로 북한과의 교역을 하게 된다면 상황이 어떻게 변할 것인지 지금 북한에서 착취를 당하고 있는 피해자들이 그분들의 상황이 좋아질 것인지 그러니까 성착취라든가 노동착취라든가 그 상황이 어떻게 변할 것인지 만약에 교역을 하게 되면
변화는 굉장하다고 생각을 하고요. 왜냐하면 북한에서는 일을 하면 정부로부터 전혀 아무런 대가가 없고 만약 일을 하지 않으면 감옥을 가야 합니다. 근데 만약 북한이 열리고 우리 한국이 북한을 이제 정부에 들어서서 하나가 된다고 하면 뭐 그런 착취 같은 건 전혀 없어질 게 뻔하고요. 또 나라가 한국하고 열렸을 때 탈북자들이 생겨나서 중국으로 나올 일이 없기 때문에 인신매매에 여성들이나 아이들이 노출될 수 있는 그런 일이 없기 때문에 굉장한 변화를 가져올 수 있다고 생각합니다.
What happens in North Korea nowadays is that if one is not officially employed, if one is officially unemployed, they have to go to jail. I believe that if North Korea were to open itself up to the outside world, to South Korea in particular, this would create opportunities for North Koreans. There would be different standards. There would be less exploitation inside North Korea. And since the situation inside North Korea would improve, there would be fewer or no reasons for North Koreans to escape from their country and become the victims of exploitation elsewhere in China in particular.
그리고 많은 나라들이 이제 북한하고 이제 통일이 되면 통일 자금이 어마어마하고 북한을 다시 세우는데 돈이 많이 들기 때문에 안 좋다라고도 얘기를 하지만 전쟁을 위해서 준비하고 무기를 만들고 하는 그 북한에서 드는 돈, 한국에서 드는 돈이면 북한 경제 살리고 인신매매자들 더 이상 생기지 않아서 굉장한 강대국을 만들 수 있다고 저는 이제 생각을 하고 있습니다.
There are many who fear the astounding cost of Korean reunification. They fear that we would need a lot of money to accomplish that goal. However, I have a different opinion. I think that both Koreas will be spending much, much less on their defense budgets, and there would be significant amounts of money to be spent on the development of North Korea. And North Koreans would no longer be victimized. They would no longer become the victims of sexual or labor exploitation.
그리고 이제 두 가지를 이제 의원님들한테 부탁드리고 싶은 일들이 있는데 저희 탈북자들 저는 지금 미국 시민권을 받았습니다. 그리고 천국 같은 곳에서 이제 학교를 다니고 일을 하고 텍스를 내면서 이제 열심히 미국 시민으로서 살아가는데 우리 탈북자들이 미국에서 배우고 느낀 거를 북한이 열렸을 때 북한에 들어가서 미국과 한국에 대한 자유, 이 사회 문화를 전할 수 있는 유일한 사람들입니다. 그렇기 때문에 미국에서 좀 더 많은 탈북자들을 받아들여 줬으면 좋겠다라는 부탁을 일단 드리고 싶습니다.
And I would like to ask the distinguished congressman here today a favor, should I call it. I am a U.S. citizen now. I work hard. I go to school here in the United States. I pay my taxes. I try to do my best as an American citizen. There are, of course, many North Koreans who are still trying to escape. When change comes to North Korea, former North Koreans such as myself will be instrumental in teaching the people of North Korea about the freedom and opportunity that we enjoy here in the United States and that South Koreans enjoy in South Korea. And that is why I would like to respectfully ask you that you see to it that more North Koreans are accepted into the United States of America.
그리고 제가 2008년도 3월 21일 날 미국에 입국을 했는데요. 2004년도 부시 대통령 시절에 탈북자 인권 법안이 통과되면서 저희는 미국을 갈 수 있다라는 희망을 가졌습니다. 근데 그 희망 이후에 몇 번이 법안이 더 통과됐지만 전 탈북자의 수는 194명밖에 안 됩니다. 그래서 앞으로 의원님들이 가능하시다면 우리 탈북자들이 다른 나라 난민들처럼 미국에 많이 올 수 있게 노력을 해주셨으면 좋겠다는 부탁을 드리고 싶고요. 또 그 나라 이름을 대고 싶진 않는데 타 나라에서 미국을 들어오려고 기다리는 프로세싱 기간이 1년에서 1년 반이 걸립니다. 그래서 그런 곳에도 한국 정부의 협조를 받거나 탈북자들 중에 하버드 대학을 졸업하고 굉장히 공부 열심히 한 일꾼들도 있습니다. 그런 사람들을 이용해서라도 좀 시간을 단축해서 북한에서 억압당하고 힘들었고 중국에서 팔려가면서 고생을 했던 사람이 감옥에서 또다시 1년 6개월이라는 시간을 기다리다가 지쳐서 포기해서 한국으로나 다른 나라로 가지 않을 수 있도록 이 좋은 미국에 올 수 있도록 노력 좀 부탁드립니다.
Frankly, when we came here, what truly gave us hope was the U.S. North Korea Human Rights Act, first passed in 2004. There have been 2 more enactments of that act in 2008 and 2012, but to this day, we only have 194 North Korean refugees who have resettled here in the United States. I'm not going to name that particular country or those particular countries, but it takes a North Korean refugee between 1 year and 1 year and a half in order to be cleared to come here to the United States. There are graduates, former North Korean refugees who graduated from Harvard University with law degrees. There are many bright South Koreans who could help. I'd like to ask the distinguished congressman for their help.
네, 감사합니다.
And Ms. Werlo, thank you for the Cuban summary as well from you. Appreciate it. And Ambassador for the global view. Yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Clausen, thank you very much for your excellent questions and for being here and for your ongoing concern. It's just deeply appreciated. Let me just conclude a couple of final questions, if I could. As we all know, and I mentioned it before, Raul Castro said, there are no political prisoners. Give me a list of political prisoners, and I will release them before tonight ends. That's the Spanish translation of what he said, the English translation of the Spanish. And Jim Acosta, thank God he asked that question because, one of the few times any of the Castro brothers have ever been asked a serious question about human rights. And that culture of denial, which we see now on the trafficking side, no forced labor, they trivialize, if not even respond to any questions about sex trafficking. My hope is that there will be a much more robust effort by the TIP office, and I think while they may get it right, hopefully as it goes up the ranks, they will do their work to ensure that Tier 3 designation, which I think is absolutely warranted based on the record, is conveyed again to the government of Cuba. And I do hope they listen to you even more carefully, Maria, as you convey these important points to them at the TIP office itself. I would ask Ambassador Legon, if I could, we know that India has had serious trafficking problems, sex and labor trafficking. And amazingly, even with regards to the T visa, which we created in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, that there has been harassment of those individuals, inability to travel by those individuals who have obtained the T visa, which then takes our whole process and say it's somehow less than authentic. Your thoughts on that? Because India certainly has a serious trafficking problem that I think is grossly underappreciated and under-recognized.
Well, India is often considered a great success story of democracy, but there are important ways, whether if you're a Dalit or other unfavored castes or women, you don't have full access to justice. There have been some troubling things that I've seen over time. When I was the head of the TIP office at State, it was really remarkable to me. If you looked at countries that had large numbers of guest workers abroad, the great heroic example was the Philippines, whose diplomatic services fought really hard for the rights and the protection of their migrant workers abroad, running shelters in every one of their embassies. They would always meet with me. Indian diplomats never, ever, in any country I traveled in, particularly in the Gulf, would confer about that. They were more concerned about the remittances. Now, that was then. When it was discovered that official personnel at a multilateral institution for India was complicit in human trafficking, the government of India was truly intransigent about cooperating with justice. If it is indeed the case that those who have a T visa are harassed, that is a failure to look out for your citizens and their access to justice. And so while India is a success story in many ways, we should be concerned, and it remains the demographic epicenter of the human trafficking problem in the world.
Ms. Veerlaw, in her testimony, said that the Cuban government is likely one of the largest and most profitable trafficking promoters in the world. Does that comport, again, with your sense of Cuba?
Well, there's kind of a correlate of the main theme of my testimony. The main theme of my testimony is that democratic governance, rule of law, access to justice, if they are in place in a country, it's more likely that country will do a good job fighting human trafficking. At the other end of the spectrum, if it's not only an autocracy, but a command economy with an intrusive state-led role and forms of forced labor or punitive labor, particularly against those who are not favored by the government, that are institutionalized, that's quite likely to be a driver of human trafficking. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, as you shaped, emphasizes the complicity of government officials in human trafficking. Well, you know, if we look at some diplomat who is engaging in the abuse of their domestic servant, that's complicity. But if a government has policies which are in fact contributing to running forced labor, that's the most flagrant form of state complicity that you can see.
I'd like to, if you have anything further that any of our witnesses would like to say today, any further insights, comments? If not, I do want to thank you for your extraordinary testimony. I hope that the U.S. Department of State and particularly the new ambassador at large, who I think is a very honorable person, Susan Kopich, who I've had a meeting with in the office. We did invite her to be here today, but they are, as she indicated, working on the report and thought it might be best not to be here, and I certainly understand that. We will invite her to testify, and I hope she will come right after the TIP report is released. And we will again have a body of NGOs and expert witnesses to ascertain the pluses and minuses of the next TIP report, and I do hope they get it right this time. I do want to thank all of you. Ms. Joe, your point about law enforcement, getting to what Ambassador Legon was just saying in terms of complicity of government. When we wrote the original minimum standards to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and government complicity, we absolutely included the police. And you pointed out, because they are part of government, law enforcement is certainly an integral part of government, and very often that is the Achilles heel, because that's where the bribes and the face-to-face, the interface usually takes place with enabling trafficking or being part of the solution. So thank you for pointing that out with regards to the North Koreans and others who are ill-served by the police who are part of the problem. I thank you all again. The hearing is adjourned.